Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Dolley was at a very interesting place in her life, very dramatic place, when she met James Madison. She was born in the Virginia gentry in 1768, but her parents were Quakers. Her mother was a Quaker and her father was a convert. And they lived a rather quiet country life until when Dolley was about 15, her father decided, out of Quaker conscience, to free his slaves. So with freed slaves, they couldn't be agricultural laborers. So they left Virginia and moved to Philadelphia, which was the seat of American Quakerism. And in that 10 years, between age 15 and when she was about 26, all kinds of bad things happened to Dolley Madison. So all of her brothers died one by one. She lost a sister, a little baby sister. Her father was disowned by the Quakers. He went bankrupt. Her mother had to open a boarding house. She married a man that she probably did on some level love, but it was definitely at her father's insistence. She had 2 children, but in the Great Yellow Fever epidemic of 1793, she lost her husband and she lost her newborn baby. So when she meets James Madison, she's back in Philadelphia, that's the capital at that point, and she meets this congressman from Virginia. She's 25, 26 years old, a widow with a young son, very beautiful, as everybody seems to say. And, well, it wasn't love at first sight for her, but it was for him. James Madison, as hard as it is to imagine, was smitten with her and waxed lyrical about his beloved. But for her, I think it was a marriage that was more practical. She wanted, of course, to remarry. She wanted a father for her son. But the question is really, why James Madison? For all that he is a sterling intellect, I don't think anybody would ever consider him sexually attractive. And she was, as I said, quite lovely. But I think that really the attraction that James held for Dolley was that by marrying him, she would return to that first world, that world of childhood. She would return to the Virginia gentry. So I think the fact that he was a Southerner was what was compelling to her. I like the title of this series, Constitutional Conversations, because you might ask, what part did Dolley play in the conversation, given that the Constitution was written before she was even met him? And the answer really lies in the thought behind not just the Constitution, but the whole Republican experiment. So I think we're familiar with some antecedents to the Constitution, like the Magna Carta. We think of sometimes the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as a Lockean document, John Locke. But there was another school of thought that was very influential at the time, and it's called the Scottish Enlightenment. And it came from a group of mostly men in the early part of the 18th century. This is the new Scotland, the Scotland that was incorporated into Great Britain. And the famous names you might recognize are David Hume and Adam Smith. And this was a school of thought that was perfect for a young nation who was creating its own laws, which sounds very exciting, but is also very scary. And in short, what the Scottish Enlightenment said was that laws may come and go because they were building new laws, but what holds society together? And the answer was what they called manners. Now, manners were not what fork to use, but really how we treat each other, conventions, customs, long-held beliefs, tradition. And if you think about it, the people in charge of that thing usually are women. And so in the conception of the Scottish Enlightenment, women had an important role to play. They were going to hold the whole thing together while the men kind of tried these laws out. So upon meeting Dolley, she certainly could have fit into this idea. Because remember, the Founding Fathers were not just creating a new kind of government. They saw it, quite rightly, as the world made anew. And that meant that every element of society, whether it was how we interacted with each other or social events or how we did almost anything, built our houses, had to be Republican, as they would put it, a small R Republican. That's one way I think that Dolley enters the constitutional conversation. I must also say that the Constitution, I always say it's a blueprint for government, but it's not a handbook. It's a theory that really had never been tried in all of human history. A republic, a big republic, a modern republic, how was that going to work? Well, James Madison and other founders gave it a lot of deep thought, but it was up to what I call, with a nod to Star Trek, the next generation, to put it into action. How was this really going to work on the ground? Now, Dolley was, about 17 years younger than James. She's still a little bit part of the founding generation, but she's got her foot in that next generation. And she's going to be the one who's going to take these precepts and work them out in the federal government. And she does so in very interesting ways. I've called Dolley a master politician, and I've called her a political genius. And as a professor, if this was going to be on the test, I would say there are really two buckets of accomplishment. There's a practical bucket and a psychological bucket. And in her practical accomplishments, she establishes for Washington City, with her White House, a place where everybody could come together. So she's famed for redecorating the White House, but it's safer to say that she reconstructed it. She reconstructed the White House, the executive mansion as it was then, to have large public rooms. This is hard to believe, but before Dolley's version of the executive mansion, there was no one place in Washington where everybody could come together. That means everybody from all branches from the government, let alone their families, let alone locals or visitors. But Dolley did that, so she created a place for politics. And she created what I call an unofficial sphere. So the government, the federal government at that time, was deliberately, lamentably light on bureaucracy. So as part of the commitment to pure republicanism, that theory that is driving the government, the founders wanted to get rid of anything that smacked of courts or monarchies or kings. And so they really downplayed what we would think of as the social sphere, but they also downplayed really the bureaucracy. But politics needed a place to get done, and where was it going to happen? And it turned out in early Washington City, it happened at Dolley's drawing rooms. And she held them every Wednesday, and they were sort of like cocktail parties, and everybody came, and everybody had access to the president. No president has ever offered more access than James Madison during those years, but they also had access to each other. And in addition to a lot of what I call meat and potatoes politicking, what got done there was really that these Americans were coming together and they were starting to learn to work together. And the reason that's important, and the reason that what Dolley did was not just nice, but crucial, was that this was an era where they believed, the political culture believed, that one party should rule. And that if you weren't of that party, you were a traitor. Not just dissenting, but a traitor. Now the problem is two parties believed that. What they didn't know was they were building really a two-party democracy. And they were going to have to learn to work together. They were going to have to learn to tolerate political dissent. And they begin steps toward that. Not in the houses of Congress, but at Dolley's drawing room. So there's some very practical dimensions that Dolley sort of did. But the most interesting part of her accomplishments are the psychological. So as part of the commitment to pure republicanism, which feared anything that smacked of courts or kings, the Constitution is very light on ceremony. There are no rituals in the Constitution, no ceremonies, except the inauguration, and it's very light on that too. And again, this is deliberate. They didn't want anything that smacked of churches and pomp and circumstance. But it turns out that baby democracies and budding republics need the ritual of ceremony. And so Dolley turned the White House, as it became known under her tenure, the White House by its nickname, into a kind of ritual, a kind of ceremony. The regularity of those drawing rooms every Wednesday became a kind of ritual. And she supplied the ceremony in the way she dressed and in the way she acted. So she dressed not really as a real queen would. In fact, her outfits were a little outlandish, frankly, but she dressed as most Americans would imagine a queen would dress. And she would dress in, ermine and velvet and jewels with her famous turbans, and there'd be feathers attached or a little diamond crown attached, and she's embodying this royal message. She is ceremony. And that construction of herself is something I call the Republican Queen. And there's a paradox there, because republicanism is, about simplicity, but she was a queen. And she became what we call in political science a charismatic figure. And a charismatic figure is somebody who can appear larger than life and who can carry important psychological and emotional messages to a populace. And she was perfectly suited for that. And all of Dolley's work, the creation of the White House and even the capital city as both a practical place for politics and a symbol, her creation of the Republican Queen, all of this work she embarks upon, and it becomes even more crucial, though she couldn't have known it, when America goes to war in 1812. So all of Dolley's practical and psychological political work was all to help her husband's policies, particularly his concern about unity. But when we go to war, she kind of rises above even that, and she becomes a symbol for America. So no man could really embody America or the United States of America at that time, because every man was associated with one political party or another. But Dolley was a woman, and because she was a woman and therefore, above politics, I put that in quotes, she actually can seem to rise above the partisan fray and embody that. And so the work that she does sets her up to really become this charismatic figure, not just for James Madison, but for America. So when she has her most famous moment, the one we all know, where she saves the picture of George Washington in the face of the British, and really risking her own life, it's really the culmination of a process where she's been positioning herself for almost 16 years. So it's not just that one moment, it's really the end of a process. Looking at Dolley's words and her work, as well as those of her colleagues, I began to understand a dynamic that I call the official sphere and the unofficial sphere. So the official sphere of politics is the one we're most familiar with. I think of it as kind of the product of politics. It's the election, the legislation, the proclamation, the press release, and it's usually in official spaces. Even the Rose Garden is considered an official space, but Congress, the president's office. But what's most interesting to me, and what Dolley really showed me, was the power of the unofficial sphere. And that's about the process of politics. That's the place where the deals are made, where people can propose things that they wouldn't necessarily propose or negotiate, outside of the glare of the official spotlight. And this unofficial sphere often takes place at social events, at homes, in what we call private spaces. And when you look at this, you understand the sort of dynamic of the official and the unofficial sphere. You see that you need both to have politics. And in fact, what the women of Washington, including Dolley, were doing would later become a profession called lobbyists. So lobbyists are called lobbyists because they did their work outside the official sphere of Congress. They did it in the lobby. These women are doing it in their own homes and at social events. Now, let me say that this doesn't make Washington unique. The role of social events, of homes, of sociability has a long history in Western culture, and you look at it when you see shows about the British royalty or British gentry. You see a lot of work being done by women. In Washington City, though, something happened, something shifted. Because of the commitment to pure republicanism, that theory that abhorred anything monarchical, anything to do with courts and kings, the founders deliberately constructed a federal government that was very lean. It did not have a big bureaucracy. And they were afraid of the social sphere. They didn't want those big parties that courts had. So there was very little social sphere, there was very little official sphere. So what happened in that vacuum, though, was that the women of Washington, led by Dolley, created that unofficial sphere, and it assumed an even greater importance. If you don't have a place in Congress where you can talk to somebody from across the aisle, and you couldn't do it in Congress, then that drawing room or Dolley's carriage or a tea party assumed a much greater importance. And In the old world, in the colonial America or in Western Europe, men did a lot of this kind of unofficial stuff, but they couldn't do it in Washington. So women assumed a disproportionate, again, I would say, importance in their work. One of the things I really discovered that was happening in what I call the unofficial sphere was patronage. Now, patronage is the official definition, is the awarding of titles, money, or other goods in return for political favors. I always say, whatever state I am, I always say, I can't believe I'm explaining patronage to people in fill in the state, but there it is. We all know what it is. But nothing scared the founders more than patronage because it symbolized the court. And they were constructing a new world, not like the old world, with its patronage and its favors and its connection making and all of that stuff. So they were not going to play patronage. And in fact, if you look at Thomas Jefferson's correspondence, I think he writes worriedly about patronage more than any other topic. Of course, there's always something suspicious about people who keep denying that they're doing anything. And patronage might seem corrupt, the kind of rewarding of supporters, but the truth is, a government needs a little patronage. You need to be able to reward supporters, and you need to also surround yourself with friends and not enemies. So John Adams did himself a real disservice. In order to appear virtuous, and not that he was playing patronage, he took on the cabinet of his predecessor, Washington, and they all hated John Adams. And so he got very little done, and what he did get done wasn't very good in many ways, because he didn't actually play patronage. What happens then, because as like nature, politics abhors a vacuum, is that the women of Washington began playing patronage. And Dolley Madison has been called the Queen of Washington City. She was also the Queen of influence peddling. And the women of Washington even developed a language of patronage that disguised what they were doing. So for a long time, I would read these letters between Dolley and, say, Martha Jefferson Randolph, who was Thomas Jefferson's daughter. And they seemed to be talking about some young man and how worthy he was and how he loved his mother and his sisters and how his sister's health needed a change of scene. And couldn't you get somebody a job? And I had to kind of look past that language that seemed so personal, and it seemed about love and care, and realize this was blatant influence peddling. But Dolley she staffed the federal government both at home in Washington City and across the country. So that was really another part of her work that I found quite striking and quite unexpected. As a historical figure of the early 19th century, we also have to consider Dolley in relation to slavery, because that is the dominant issue of the time. What's interesting about her upbringing, because she was a Quaker and because her father moved his family from Quaker conscience from Virginia to Philadelphia, we know she was aware of slavery in a way that many Americans maybe weren't, certainly many Virginians. What I wish as a historian, you always wish for documents you can't find, is that when she's 26, Dolley Madison, living in the seat of American Quakerism, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, decides to marry James Madison. And by doing so, she is going to return to the world of the slaveholding gentry. Did she think about it? Or did she just go back to that world of her childhood without a backward glance? And we'll just never know. Certainly by the time she's in her 40s and she's been married to James for many years and back in Virginia, she is as unattractive a slaveholder as anyone. So as any Southerner anyway, when she writes about her enslaved people, she's sort of outraged and entitled, and she talks quite blatantly about them as property in a way that we find very disconcerting, because she is known as this incredibly loving and generous and empathic person, which she was, but when she talks about slaves, she doesn't talk about them in any worse way than any Southerner, but it's pretty jarring. And then after James Madison's death, when he doesn't free his slaves and she starts selling them off, she comes in for a lot of criticism, because now we're talking about the 1840s from the abolitionist press. So she does not have a good record with slavery. Through my historical work, I hope I make the case for Dolley as an important historical figure. But I always think that history is not doing its job unless it can say something to us. And so, what does Dolley say to us? And I think her lasting gift to the nation is a political model that she modeled for us. So this is an era in politics where she lived, where it was violent, where men killed each other and beat each other up over politics, over political ideology, and not just in the streets, but in the halls of Congress. But Dolley Madison modeled for us a way of politicking that was based on civility and on empathy. It stressed cooperation over coercion. It built bridges instead of bunkers. And the underlying power behind it was love. And I think as we move forward in our politics and we decide who we're going to be, we often look back and we say, what can history teach us? And in this case, I hope we look back, we look to Dolley Madison, and we choose love.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.